And now your Idaho Real Estate News.
An agent from another brokerage writes up an offer on your listing. While reviewing the real estate purchase and sell agreement, you notice that the other agent has listed your broker as the responsible broker for the transaction. Is that right? Can the other agent designate your broker to be the responsible broker for this transaction? This is Mike Johnston, contributing editor for Idaho Real Estate News. When it comes to a real estate office, there is one person who definitely wears more than one hat, the broker. The broker can be the office trainer, recruiter, janitor, network administrator, printer setter-upper, Wi-Fi configurer, forms explainer, and sometimes even a relationship counselor. We definitely are thankful for all of our real estate brokers. The Idaho Real Estate Commission in the Idaho Real Estate License Law and Rules, July 2020, defines a responsible broker, Idaho Code 54-2004, under definitions. Paragraph 44, responsible broker, means the designated broker in the regulated real estate transaction who is responsible for the accounting and transaction files for the transaction in the manner described in section 54-2048 Idaho Code, end quote. What are the duties and responsibilities of the responsible broker for the transaction? Idaho Code 54-2048, responsible broker for the transaction, duties and record keeping, state, the responsible broker, as defined to in this section, shall be responsible to the commission for the transaction records, the funds and closing in accordance with the requirements of this chapter. The broker who lists and sells any real property shall be deemed the responsible broker in the transaction. In the case of a cooperative sale, the broker who holds entrusted funds in a real estate trust account while the transaction is pending, or who delivers or transfers the funds to the closing agency, or any authorized party other than the cooperating broker in the transaction, shall be deemed the broker responsible for the transaction. The responsible broker shall, okay, let's stop here. Let's discuss a few things here before we go on. Who is deemed the responsible broker in a transaction? The broker who lists and sells real property. That means if there is one broker involved in the transaction, he or she would be deemed the responsible broker for the transaction. What if there are two different brokerages involved in the transaction, meaning ABC Realty and XYZ Real Estate, two offices? Which broker from which brokerage is deemed the responsible broker for that transaction? It says that the broker who holds entrusted funds in a real estate account while the transaction is pending, or who delivers or transfers the funds to the closing agency, or any authorized party other than the cooperating broker in the transaction shall be deemed the broker responsible for the transaction. Which brokerage typically counsels with the buyer about earnest money and where it will be placed? I believe it would be the brokerage working with the buyer or the selling agency, as shown on a real estate purchase and sell agreement. This brokerage could hold the funds in their brokerage's trust account, or they could deliver it to the closing agency, a title company, or any authorized party like a home builder, as long as it is not given to the cooperating or the listing brokerage. So if the selling agency, the brokerage working with the buyer, does that, then which broker is deemed the responsible broker? The selling agency's broker. So why do you sometimes see the listing agency's broker listed then? Good question. I don't know why that is attempted. I do not know why or what is trying to be accomplished by that. I just ask the agents to correct it and change it to the broker that is deemed the responsible broker, the selling agency's broker. Now back to the statute. The responsible broker shall, 1, ensure the correctness and delivery of detailed closing statements that accurately reflect all receipts and disbursements for their respective accounts to both the buyer and seller in a transaction, even if the closing is completed by a real estate escrow closing agent, title company, or other authorized third party, and regardless of the responsible broker's agent or non-agent relationship to the buyer or seller, end quote. So they are to look over the closing statements that may have been prepared by the title company for accuracy. Let's continue. Quote 2, show proof of delivery of the closing statement to the buyer and seller by their signatures on copies of such closing statements, which shall be retained in the broker's transaction file. When signatures of the parties cannot be obtained, a copy of the closing statement transmittal letter sent by certified mail, return receipt requested, or a written certification of delivery signed by an officer of the escrow closing agency shall be maintained in the broker's transaction files, end quote. So they're to make sure that the buyers and sellers both receive a copy of the closing statement with signatures. They are also to keep copies in the broker's transaction file. Quote 3, create and maintain for the retention period required in section 54-2049 Idaho Code, a transaction file containing the following documents as applicable. For all pending, closed, or fallen transactions, the original or a true and correct copy of A, signed closing statements, if applicable, B, written and signed brokerage representation agreements, if any. A responsible broker who is representing both the seller and the buyer in a transaction shall retain properly executed brokerage representation agreements in the transaction file, and, if appropriate to the transaction, a properly executed consent to limited dual representation statement. A responsible broker who has a signed brokerage representation agreement with only one party to the transaction, either the buyer or seller, must retain only that one agreement in the transaction file. C, all offers accepted, countered, or rejected, which must be retained in the manner required in section 54-2049 Idaho Code. D, the original or a true and correct copy of all rejected offers must be retained in the files of the selling broker for the statutory records retention period in section 54-2049 Idaho Code, end quote. They must also maintain a transaction file with all of that information for at least 3 calendar years after the year in which the event or transaction occurred. So basically 4 years. That's Idaho Code 54-2049. Now would be a good time to address what the responsible broker's responsibility, or lack thereof, is when there is an earnest money dispute. Many people, including brokers, do not understand the limits that the responsible broker may have when it comes down to an earnest money dispute. Let's review entrusted funds. Idaho Code 54-2041, trust account and entrusted property states, quote, a licensed Idaho real estate broker shall be responsible for all monies or property entrusted to that broker or to any licensee representing the broker, end quote. It also explains what is not considered entrusted funds. It says, quote, for purposes of this section, monies or property shall not be considered entrusted to the broker or to any licensee representing the broker when the parties to the transaction have instructed the broker or its licensees in writing to transfer such monies or property to a third party, including but not limited to a title, an escrow, or a trust company, if upon transfer, the broker or its licensees have no right to exercise control over the safekeeping or disposition of said monies or property, end quote. On the real estate purchase and sell agreement, the buyer and seller can instruct the responsible broker to have the earnest money be held by a trust company, a title company, the earnest money holder. When the parties plan to close the transaction, the closing company. This can be considered the written instructions the statute asks for. The title company, the earnest money holder, is now in control as to how they handle the disputed funds or the disputed earnest money. Some title companies, the earnest money holder, want to give it to the broker working with the buyers and let them handle it. If that broker is willing to accept responsibility for it, the title company, the earnest money holder, has the broker sign a form releasing the title company, the earnest money holder, from any and all responsibilities arising from them, releasing the earnest money to the broker. Question. Didn't we learn that the parties to the transaction need to instruct where the funds are to be held in writing? Did they authorize the earnest money holder, the title company, to release it to one of the brokerages in writing? No, that is not part of the executed contract. I wouldn't want to take on that responsibility. In this case, the responsible broker for the transaction should not be the one releasing the earnest money being held by another. They are not the earnest money holder. On the Idaho Association of Realtors RE-21 Real Estate Purchase and Sale Agreement, under paragraph 30, default, it states, and I'm just going to read the part that I want to emphasize. Quote, 30, default. If buyer defaults in the performance of this agreement, seller has the option of 1, accepting the earnest money as liquidated damages, or 2, pursuing any other lawful right and or remedy to which the seller may be entitled. If the seller elects to proceed under 1, seller shall make a demand upon the holder of the earnest money. End quote. So who is the demand to be made to? Is it the responsible broker? No. It is to be made to the holder of the earnest money. Who is the holder of the earnest money? In this case, the closing company, the title company. Wait a minute. Under the earnest money dispute paragraph, paragraph 31, doesn't it say that the broker can say how to disperse the earnest money? Let's look at what it says. Keep in mind as to who the holder of the earnest money. Is it the broker? Or in this case, the closing company, the title company. Quote, 31, earnest money dispute interpleader. Notwithstanding any termination or breach of this agreement, buyer and seller agree that in the event of any controversy regarding the earnest money and things of value held by broker or closing company, broker may reasonably rely on the terms of this agreement or other written documents signed by both parties to determine how to disperse the earnest money. However, broker or closing company shall not be required to take any action, but may await any proceeding or at broker's or closing company's option and sole discretion, may interplead all parties and deposit any monies or things of value into a court of competent jurisdiction, and shall recover all costs which were incurred as a result of the dispute, including, but not limited to, reasonable attorney's fees. If either party's broker incurs attorney's fees as a result of any earnest money dispute, whether or not formal legal action is taken, said broker is entitled to recover actual fees incurred from either buyer or seller, end quote. It is up to the holder of the earnest money to decide what process they're going to follow to disperse disputed earnest money. It is not in the hands of the responsible broker. When in doubt, reach out to your broker and ask them for assistance about what the responsible broker is responsible for. This has been another segment of Idaho Real Estate News. If you found this article useful, please share it with others. Subscribe by adding us to your Alexa flash briefing or by sending us an email to johnston@micro.com. That's johnston@mykro.com. We have a website with all of our past topics that have been discussed. Visit the website IREN.news for more information. There you can also submit topics you would like us to cover. We are available for you to subscribe and listen to us as a podcast. You can find us on many of your favorite places where you subscribe to other podcasts. Search for Idaho Real Estate News. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for more insights on forms and other real estate topics. For Idaho Real Estate News, I'm Mike Johnston.
Idaho Real Estate News is updated weekly.